Welcome to part 2 of this video. I had to split it up into two because it was going to be way too long to talk about all 4 of the Ruinous legendaries in one video. So if you want to see part 1, which features the fish and the deer with the ball on its head, that will be linked in the video description. But this video is talking about the snail and the saber-toothed cat, which, starting with the cat, we have Dark Ice type, which is a fairly good offensive typing because ice is a fairly good offensive typing. And there are not too many Pokemon that resist both of the stab, and there are no immunities as well. So a relatively consistent offensive typing to work with here. However, defensively it's not great. You do have the 4x from fighting, as well as 5 other things super effective on you. And because this is an ice type, you have very little resist on this, but you do at least have dark type psychic immunity. So you definitely don't want to use this defensively, and a defensive Terra type might be essential if you want to keep this around on the battlefield for any considerable amount of time. As for the defensive Terra types, I actually think Fairy would be quite good for this, though I could definitely see maybe Ghost or Water Terra type as well. Water's just such a good defensive Terra type to have. It's common for a reason, and would certainly help you against Steel and Fire. So I think Water or Ghost would be ideal. Now, the saber-toothed cat lowers defense with its Sword of Ruin. All of these abilities are really quite strong, and they all lower a stat by 25%, which is not as much as, say, Intimidate or an ability that lowers a stat in that way, but this will bypass Defiant and other abilities that prevent stat drops, which lowering defense pairs quite well with the stats of this Pokemon. We have a pretty good 120 physical attack, so you have good physical ice and dark offense here. It's also quite fast at 135, which is the same speed as Fluttermane, which interestingly both Fluttermane and this Pokemon can knock each other out with a single hit. So winning that speed tie would probably be very essential for certain matchups, and you're basically just going for a 50-50 at that point. Now, this also does have a little bit of special attack. It's still not enough that you would probably run special attack on this. So this is essentially wasted stats here, I guess, as a means of balancing it. It does not have that great of special defense, though the physical defense it's not bad. You would be able to take a hit that's not super effective quite well, unless it's a really strong hit. Now, all of these get access to Ruination, which is essentially the same signature move as the Tapu's, but it's dark type. I don't think you would run Ruination on this Pokemon. It's already quite offensive as is. You'd probably be better off just running offensive moves, which this does get some good ones. You have 2 priority moves, even though this is the fastest of them, it gets priority moves, in the form of Ice Shard and Sucker Punch. Both great options, and I could definitely see one of these running, even both of those really. That speed control is very helpful to have access to. But this does also get moves like Throat Chop and Icicle Crash, though I don't think you would run Icicle Crash when you have the option to run Ice Spinner. It's just a far more consistent move altogether. Now, this Pokemon gets some very interesting moves. So we do have Icy Wind, which, given this Pokemon's high speed stat, you could actually use this as a form of speed control. It also gets Mist and Haze. Not very many Pokemon get both of those. And it also gets Sacred Sword for, I guess, some coverage, and Sacred Sword's just a good move in general. Recover. This is the only one of the 4 that gets Recover, which is quite strange because this is the least bulky of the 4. Though so far I have not seen Recover utilized on this Pokemon. I think all of these get Snarl. At least it seems like it. This one also has Snarl. You do have Brick Break and Psychic Fangs. Both moves do the exact same thing. I think Psychic Fangs is technically better though, because it is higher damage. And you do get Taunt and Sword Stance, which, depending on how this is set up, could be quite useful. And it does actually have a flying move in the form of Acrobatics. There is Aerial Ace too, but I think Acrobatics is technically better. And if you're running Focus Sash and this thing just gets smacked by a fighting type hit and your Focus Sash activates, if that were to happen, your Acrobatics would be double damage, which could be quite a good answer to potential fighting types. This is an interesting Pokemon because it has pretty good offense. Aside from access to Fake Out, it really plays a lot like Weavile. And having access to priority moves of both stabs is very nice to have, but I think this Pokemon is a bit limited by its typing, as well as it having the least optimized stats of all of these, because it has 90 special attack for some reason. And while I think it will be common early on, I think over time this is going to end up being the least common of the Ruinous legendaries, because it's very squishy, and its speed stat being tied with Flutter Mane is good, but also not good at the same time. I do think if this Pokemon were one base stat faster, so as fast as Iron Bundle, I think this would actually be a lot better. But having that speed tie with Flutter Mane makes this kind of a risky Pokemon to run, because even having access to Sucker Punch, it's not a guarantee that Sucker Punch is going to win you a match, especially when your opponent's looking for that Sucker Punch. So I think it has good offensive potential, definitely really bad defensive potential though, which limits it in what it can do, and that's going to make it very predictable, which when something is predictable, it's easy to plan for. Okay, now we have the Snail, which is a Dark and Grass type. Offensively, it's really not that good. You do have 5 super effectives, but there are a good bit more Pokemon that resist this typing compared to the other 3. And defensively, you're weak to a lot of stuff. You do still have the Psychic Immunity from Dark, which is nice, but you're weak to 7 things, one of those being a 4x from Bug, which for the most part is not a big deal, but it just means that fighting Amoonguss could be quite difficult if Amoonguss is running Pollen Puff. And this typing does not actually fight Amoonguss that well. You'll have to rely solely on the Dark type offense for that. You do, however, have the Powder Immunity from Grass, which is always great to have and prevents this from being put to sleep by an Amoonguss. As for defensive Terra types, Fairy is actually pretty well suited for this. You would still be weak to Poison, but that turns the Bug and Fighting weakness into Bug and Fighting Resist. And as always, I could see Water on this. You could put Water Terra type on just about any Pokemon, and it's a good Terra type for it, because Water's just such a good defensive typing. Now this Pokemon is the one that lowers attack, so it has the ability closest to Intimidate, which if we look at the stats, it's very similar to the Deer with a Bull on its head. I think it's Tinglu, if I remember that correctly, where you have a lot of defense on one stat, and the ability covers the other defensive stat. So we have very nice special defense here. With an Assault Vest, this would be very difficult to break through, especially. It does also have pretty good physical defense, which synergizes quite well with its ability. Now, the speed stat's interesting because it's 70. It's a lot faster than I thought it would be. And the offensive stats are very similar. It's not like one is really better than the other, so you could run this as a mixed attacker, but it's really hard to just say, oh yeah, the special attack is so much better than the physical attack, because it really isn't. And you could pick either or for this Pokemon. Just depending on how your team is set up, either offensive stat could be useful. Now, personally, I think the special attack is a little bit more ideal, just because you get better grass moves on the special side. But while I don't think the stats are bad, they're also not super optimized, and they're very well rounded, which I think that lack of specialization could cost it in the long term. Now, I think this Pokemon could benefit quite well from Ruination. It actually has the least offense of all of them, so Ruination would be great for this Pokemon if you want to run it super bulky, that is. This Pokemon does have some interesting offensive options. On the physical side, we have things like Power Whip and Knockoff, but on the special side, we have Leaf Storm, Giga Drain, and Dark Pulse, so you really could run it either way, but I think what I would do is run it special, but put Foul Play on it. That way it technically has physical offense, but it's not having to use your physical offense stat. The only issue with this, its ability kind of messes with Foul Play's offensive potential and actually reduces its damage by 25%. So there is that one caveat there, but I still think it's a good option to have and allows this to be a mixed attacker without you having to invest in both attack stats. Now, some other options, this does also get Solar Beam and Pollen Puff, which Pollen Puff is a great way to answer itself and might be able to one-hit itself, honestly. It does also get Body Press, which again, this does not have a way to buff its physical defense, similar to Tinglu, kind of disappointing, but oh well. This Pokemon does get Screens, which I think would work quite well on this. It does also get Taunt, And yes, they all do get Snarl, so that is an option here as well. Now this Pokemon also gets Leech Seed, which I think is a very interesting option for this Pokemon because this Pokemon can stall quite well. Because it takes less damage from physical offense and has quite high special defense, you really could set up Leech Seed and just stall really hard with this Pokemon. Also having access to things like Giga Drain and Ingrain, you really could just give this so much passive healing that you're basically fighting one of those annoying Ludicolo builds that just wants to stall you out to death. So I think this Pokemon has a good bit of potential. It'll be interesting to see if its typing hinders that potential or not. I'm not actually quite sure, because as we've seen with Brute Bonnet, it is still used, but typically Amoonguss is used more. Even though Brute Bonnet has better stats, its typing isn't always better suited for defensive play. So I think this Pokemon's quite strong. As far as what I am going to try to build a team for, I want to build a team for this one, because I think this one's kind of funny. And I want to see if I can get like the stall build version of this to actually work in a competitive format. Now, I think this one and the cat are going to be the least used of the four. Though I couldn't quite tell you which one's going to be more useful in the long term, but I think in the short term, you'll probably see the cat more often. That being said, they're all strong. They all have great options and great abilities that even if you just use them for their abilities, they will be extremely useful in a competitive format. But their overall utility varies a lot, and I think the fish has the highest utility, followed by the deer. But that all could change. As more Pokemon get added into the game via DLC, there might be some excellent synergies that show up later down the road for some of these lesser used ones. And we could see any four of these becoming very common later on, just depending on whatever potential synergies may show up in the future. But anyway, that's gonna be it for part 2. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all in Regulation C.